Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. King Arthur and Queen Guinevere are radiantly happy at their castle in Camelot. Almost every seat is filled at the round table. And very soon after the knights have made their solemn vows, their words are put to the test, when a lovely maiden in distress appears in the great hall. Helping her may be the first quest for the knights of the round table, but it certainly isn't the last. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. King Arthur and his Knights. The Seat Perilous. One spring morning, the sun rose bright and beautiful over the high towers of Camelot. The birds were singing among the apple blooms. The oak trees were shaking out their little tufts of greeny gold. The May blossoms were nodding their heads among the long grass all spangled with dew. Camelot was hung with banners and flags. Its doors were decorated with silken curtains, and its pathways were arched with rainbows of flowers. Magnificent tapestries adorned the walls. Fresh rushes, mixed with garlands, covered the stone floors. Servants were hastening here and there with silver dishes containing cakes and fruits and honey, and golden goblets and wine. For King Arthur's wedding day was close at hand, and Guinevere was on her way to Camelot with a train of ladies-in-waiting and a bodyguard of knights. They were bringing, too, the round table that had been made by Merlin in imitation of the silver table brought so long ago by Joseph and the rich fisher to the country of Westover the Sea. At this round table, as you know, the young king had taken his knightly vow. How glad he was to think that it was to stand under the roof of Camelot, and that sitting all about it, his fellow knights would join in his wedding breakfast. He stood with Merlin in the great gateway of his royal castle, dressed in armor that shone like gold. All about him were his faithful courtiers, waiting to greet the strangers who were coming from the court of Leodocran. The great company of the round table was to be completed today. Many knights had made the vow in times gone by. Some had failed to keep it, and some had been killed in battle. But today, the day before Arthur's wedding, every seat was to be filled. This was the king's purpose, as he waited at the entrance of his castle in his armor of gold. Presently from the distance came the murmur of a crowd, the tramping of horses' feet, and the roll of wheels. Over the hills toward Camelot poured the glittering procession of the royal bride, banners waving, and minstrels singing stirring and noble songs. It was a magnificent sight, and no less magnificent was the sight that was waiting for the strangers in King Arthur's own splendid court. Arthur's heart was beating fast with excitement and joy as the procession came along the meadow until it halted at the great castle gates. He moved forward and bent very, very low, for on the leading horse he saw his lovely Lady Guinevere, riding in royal dignity, a rich hood hiding her beautiful golden hair, and an embroidered and jeweled cloak hanging from her slender shoulders. Close behind her rode pages, ready to answer any call that she might give. Then came her ladies-in-waiting, each with a handsome knight in attendance. In the very midst of the procession marched a tall old man in white, crowned with mistletoe, and singing songs to the sound of a harp that he held in his hands, while a number of men followed just behind, carrying the round table. King Arthur stepped forward and lifted Guinevere from her horse. Who knows what fond words he whispered to her before he set her on the ground. Then he took her hand and led her forward across the courtyard, between rows of smiling, bowing attendants, right into the castle of Camelot, with the knights and ladies who had come with her from her father's court, walking two and two behind. A beautiful throne had been set high on a dais for the princess, and Arthur led her up to it and saw her seat herself, before he turned to welcome the noble company who followed. He bowed over the hands of the fair ladies, and all the knights bent with stately courtesy in greeting. The round table was brought in and put in the very middle of the hall. Arthur drew near and watched, while his servants placed the seats about it, and when they had set as many as it would hold, the king called to all the knights who belonged to the fellowship of the Round Table to gather around. From among the brilliant company in the hall, 100 knights stepped forward, all of whom had come with Princess Guinevere from the court of her father, King Leodogran. As they approached the Round Table, Arthur counted them over one by one. When the 100 were complete, the king bowed to them once more. Then he turned to Merlin, who again stood beside him. Merlin took a roll of parchment, blazoned with many a noble coat of arms from beneath his wizard's robe, and began to read aloud from it. He was reading the names of those among Arthur's own knights who had, for their courage and their goodness, their truth, charity, and uprightness, been considered worthy to join the noble fellowship of the Round Table. Some were old and scarred with battle, some were middle-aged, some were quite young, keen and vigorous to fight for honor and for the king. When the names rang down the hall, they stepped forward one by one. Bowing to Princess Guinevere as they passed the high dais, and to King Arthur as they came to where he stood, they joined the 100 knights from the court of King Leodogran. Then the chief butler came forward with a great jeweled goblet in his hand, followed by 2 pages carrying golden jugs. The knights and the king took their seats in the great carved chairs about the table. The goblet was filled, and passing the jeweled cup from hand to hand, everybody drank to the fellowship of knights, good and brave and true, the great fellowship of the Round Table. All this time Guinevere watched, smiling and gracious, from her throne on the high dais. Her ladies-in-waiting were gathered about her, forming in their bright dresses a setting of colorful posies for her, the bright central flower. The knights looked at each other and at the king as they drank from the glittering cup. They all rose to their feet and looked toward their future queen on her throne in the midst of them, as, at a sign from Arthur, their voices rang out, loud and joyful and brave, in the words of the great vow. The sound died away, and it was now the Princess Guinevere's turn to rise to her feet, sweet and fair and royal among them all. How proud and happy the king must have felt when he saw his lady standing among these bright and gallant gentlemen, accepting their promise of chivalry with so delicate a grace. Her hair shone in the light that fell from the high windows. Her silk gown swept softly to her little slippered feet. She curtsied very low to them all, and waved her pretty white hands. Then she sat down again among her ladies, and one by one the knights of the Round Table stepped gravely forward, and, kneeling on one knee before Arthur, took the oath of loyalty to the king. Merlin stood by, his scroll of parchment again rolled up neatly in his hand. As each knight made his vow, the wizard bent his grave, wise head, but constantly he was gazing at the Round Table. He seemed, as if in a dream, to see the vision of the silver table, and Joseph, and the rich fisher, and the shining cup that was called the Holy Grail. Then, while he looked at the Round Table, he saw a mysterious thing happen. On all the seats that were placed about it, letters of gold began to appear. They looked as if they were being written by invisible fingers holding an invisible pen. As Merlin watched, these letters grew bigger and brighter, so that they could be seen from quite a long way off. The old magician moved forward to read them the more clearly, and when he stood quite close to the table, the wonder on his face changed into great gladness, for he knew that good spirits were in the banqueting hall, and that they had come from that mysterious, distant fairyland, where the silver table and the shining cup had been hidden so many, many years ago. For what do you think had been written in each seat by the invisible fingers that held the invisible pen? No less than the name of the knight who had just risen from it to do homage to King Arthur, chief of them all. It was a sure sign to Merlin that the round table had been made by his own hands for these very knights, and that their names were written also about the silver table, which had been lost to men. He called to the king and to the knights to come and read. They all gathered around, amazed, and spelled out the letters of their names, and then they took their places, shoulder to shoulder and hand to hand. But even as they did so, they saw that not every seat was filled. 2 of them, one on Arthur's right hand and the other on his left, were still empty and unnamed. Then King Arthur was very much grieved and disappointed, for he had hoped that today the fellowship of the Round Table would be complete. But Merlin had in an instant seen into the future, and he knew the secret of those 2 empty seats. He laid his hand on the king's shoulder and consoled him. "Be patient," said the magician, "be patient. In one empty seat you will very soon see somebody whom you know and admire already, though just now I shall not tell you who he is. In the other, the seat Perilous, no knight may sit today, nor tomorrow, nor for many years to come. And woe betide any knight who thinks that he might take his place at the Round Table in that place without a right. Look, see what dread legend is written there instead of a name." Arthur looked, and lo, he saw letters appear about the second empty seat, written not in gold, but in flame. Marveling, he read the words, "I am the seat Perilous." Even as he finished reading the words, they faded away. But all the knights and all the ladies, and Princess Guinevere herself, had seen the letters of flame, and throughout the court ran the murmur of the words, "That empty seat is the seat Perilous, and no knight may sit in it today, nor tomorrow, nor for many years to come." A hunt in Fairyland. King Arthur and Princess Guinevere were married with great rejoicing, and all the barons and baronesses, the dukes and duchesses of the country, came to the wedding. Such a banquet there was at Camelot, such songs and dances and tournaments, the whole neighborhood seemed to ring with the mirth of it, with the shouts and laughter and delicate music of 100 harps. Every evening, the king and queen sat at the windows of the castle, watching processions of knights with torches winding in and out among the trees. Every morning the radiant pair came out together, smiling and beautiful, to walk or ride across the meadow, so that the whole world might see them. The queen moved along daintily and silently, but the king was always watchful and alert, ready to hear grievances or to grant favors, ready even to give the order of knighthood to the poor sons of laborers and cowherds, if they could prove to him that they were as noble and valiant at heart as any gentleman of the land. And both nobles and commons bowed low, not from fear, but from love, as they passed. But a day came when Merlin told Arthur that the merriment and feasting must pause for a time, and that the king must meet his knights in sober and earnest talk, seated at the round table. So Queen Guinevere and all the ladies of the court swept and rustled away in a stately procession to the women's quarters in the castle, while the king and the knights sat down at the round table and passed the cup of fellowship from hand to hand. Then Merlin said that today the empty seat at the king's left hand was to be filled, not the seat Perilous, but the other place that had been left without a name. Everybody wondered who the chosen knight could be, and they all stood up and waited as the great wizard went out of the door of the banqueting hall to bring in the newcomer, and to present him to the king. After a minute or two, the sound of a galloping horse was heard through the window, a powerful, swift horse, which came with thundering hoofs over the drawbridge of the moat. A knight's armor clashed in the courtyard. A knight's small silken banner fluttered against the casement. Merlin's voice spoke a greeting, and deep, full, bright tones echoed in reply. Down the corridor tramped the heavy feet of the stranger, and in the doorway his form showed, tall and broad. Merlin took his hand and led him forward, and King Arthur gave a cry of amazement, for it was none other than King Pellinore, the knight who had set up his tent by the side of the woodland fountain, and who had been left lying in an enchanted sleep the last time that Arthur had seen him. But King Arthur was pleased, oh, very pleased indeed. He bore the other king no ill will for having broken his own royal sword, and very nearly his own royal head as well, in their mighty battle among the forest trees. Stepping forward, he greeted his old enemy warmly, declaring that he was a right goodly and noble knight, worthy to become a member of the Round Table. Pellinore said in reply that he was proud of many things in his life, but never prouder than at this moment, when he stood in the halls of Camelot and received the greetings of Camelot's king. Then he bent on one knee before Arthur and took the oath of fealty, and Arthur himself raised him up and placed him in the seat at the left-hand side, while the jeweled cup was passed round again, and all the other knights drank joyfully to Pellinore, the latest and almost the finest comer to the Round Table. And now Merlin made a sign to Arthur, and the king sprang to his feet and drew his sword from his scabbard. As one, the other swords flashed. There was a moment's pause, and then all the brave voices rang out together, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, their unsheathed swords glittering, their heads erect. The knights of the Round Table thundered out the words of the vow. The sound of the vow was still in the air, and not one of the company had sheathed his sword, when a great commotion arose under the windows of the castle. Hounds were baying, horns were blowing, and a little dog seemed to be barking with all its might. A long, long way off, horses might be heard galloping as well. But nobody could be quite sure of that, because, as they all stared at each other in great astonishment, the door of the banqueting hall suddenly burst open, and a great, pure white stag, with branching horns and eyes like balls of flame, bounded into the room, its hoofs, which seemed to be made of silver, flashing and ringing among the green rushes on the stone flags of the floor. No sooner had it leaped through the doorway than everybody saw that the little white dog, which had been making such a noise outside, was hard on the heels of this beautiful and mysterious deer, and following instantly came a pack of 30 couples of great black hounds in full cry after the snow-white stag. But of followers and huntsmen there was not a sign, only the sound of fairy horns blowing in the air, and the galloping of unseen horses very far away. Round the big banqueting hall swept this strange hunt, which was in very truth a hunt from Fairyland. Just as the great white stag reached the place where a young handsome knight was sitting, the little dog sprang up at it, so that the big beautiful creature leaped almost over the young knight's head. This knight was called Sir Gawain, and the stag knocked him from his feet in its flight from the little dog and the baying pack of hounds. Such a noise there was in the banqueting hall! Sir Gawain sprang up, quite bewitched, and catching up the little dog, joined the hunt, not knowing that it was a fairy hunt, and would lead him no one could tell whither. Away he ran out of the room and out of the castle, and, putting the little dog on his horse, just as huntsmen always did, went galloping off after the snow-white stag, with the 30 couples of coal-black hounds racing alongside. But no sooner was he gone out of the door than a beautiful maiden on a prancing white pony came in at another door, and rode down to the middle of the hall. Pulling up her dainty steed, she called to King Arthur to go after Sir Gawain, and to bring back the little fairy dog which he had stolen. "The little dog is mine!" cried this beautiful unknown lady. "The knight had no business to take it away. Remember the vow, King Arthur, remember the vow. I am a lady in distress, and as such you have sworn an oath to help me." King Arthur sat silent, his hand on his sword, and his eyes cast down. The vow had seemed to him such a beautiful, serious thing, and he could not believe that it had anything to do with this wild fairy hunt, and this strange fairy lady, who certainly was not made of flesh and blood, but belonged to some enchanted forest a very long way off. He heard the noise of the black hounds, and of Sir Gawain's horse, and of the little mysterious elfin dog, fade in the distance among the faintly blowing horns of the invisible company, and he had not the slightest wish to go after them. He wanted to stay quietly in his royal castle with his beautiful royal bride. As he hesitated, another startling and quite unexpected visitor came noisily in through the wide-open door. This time it was a strange, shadowy knight, almost as large as a giant, dressed in black armor, and riding a huge black horse. He trotted up to the lady, and without a word to anybody, seized her pretty white pony by the bridle. Then he wheeled his horse about, and rode quickly out of the door again, leading the lady's pony, and taking no notice of her cries and tears. It all happened so quickly that not a single knight of the Round Table had time to spring to the lady's rescue, nor even to see the face of the shadowy knight in the black armor. As they all stood breathless and amazed, King Arthur suddenly found his voice and cried aloud in ringing tones to Merlin the magician. "Tell me, O great wizard," he cried, "what is the meaning of all this magic? Whence did the fairy stag, and the fairy hounds, and the fairy lady and the shadowy black knight come? Was it not from your own enchanted forest, where stands the Perilous castle in the middle of the Valley of No Return?" Merlin, whose face had been hidden under his magician's hood, suddenly flung away the covering. Everybody saw him for a moment as an old man with a long white beard, wearing a crown of mistletoe, but even as they looked, his face changed. He seemed young and very beautiful, and the crown of mistletoe became a laurel wreath on his hair, which was golden and like a boy's. His voice, when he answered Arthur, somehow reminded the king of the invisible fairy horns, which they had all heard, and which, no doubt, had called Sir Gawain to the elfin hunt after them. "And what if the hunt is only a fairy hunt, and this lady only a fairy lady?" cried Merlin, in this new mysterious, silvery tone of voice. "Are you not brave enough to follow them into Fairyland? Is all your life going to be spent in royal castles, eating and drinking at rich banquets, listening to the music of golden harps, and meeting other knights in mock battles, with swords and shields? Do you not know what high adventure means? If not, I can tell you. It means the adventure of bright dreams, and of lovely visions, and of things that are only very dimly seen and heard. Follow the fairy hunt, good King Arthur. Pursue the vision of the snow-white stag, and the sweet, sorrowful lady in the dark night. What if she has only asked you to bring back her little white dog? What if you think it is all magic mixed with folly, and you would be better staying quietly at home? Have the kingly courage to take horse, and to follow Sir Gawain into Fairyland, to storm the doors of the castle Perilous, and to brave the darkness of the Valley of No Return. Then Arthur drew himself erect, and King Pellinore sprang to his feet at the king's right hand. "I too am a king," cried Pellinore. "I too am of royal blood. It is for kings to lead the way into the mysterious places of which the great wizard has spoken. Come, King Arthur, together we will set off on this high adventure." "You say well," cried Merlin. "You say well. You have your own good sword, King Pellinore. You have used it well and strongly more than once. Use it well and strongly again. And for you, my own great sovereign, my dearly loved Arthur, you have Excalibur. Excalibur that you took from the hand that held it high above the enchanted lake. Carry Excalibur with you, and use it always to defend right. Then you need not fear the places of dark spirits and of unhappy witcheries. Forward, forward, both of you! Go like brave and chivalrous kings into Fairyland. What you see and find there will be your great and inestimable reward." Merlin finished speaking, and folded his hood once more about his face and hair. King Arthur and King Pellinore went out of the banqueting hall and sprang each upon his own war-horse. Then off they went, side by side, after the fairy hunt, while Merlin, hidden in his hood, passed away from the sight of the knights of the Round Table. Where he went, none of them knew. Very likely back to his own home in the forest in which he had once seen the vision of Joseph, and the rich fisher, and the Holy Grail. Merlin knew that one day King Arthur and King Pellinore and all the knights of the Round Table would see the vision too, but that this would be only when they had passed through the dangers of the enchanted forest, and stormed the castle Perilous, and had gone, without losing themselves entirely, through the valley that was called the Valley of No Return. The Rescue of Nimue. King Pellinore, that huge knight who once nearly killed King Arthur, and then took a place at the Round Table and made the great vow, had many adventures in his day, but the one you are going to hear about was the greatest of all. You remember that he had galloped off at full speed after the fairy hunt. As he galloped off, he swore to himself that he would save the pretty weeping lady who had been carried off by the Black Knight, and would bring her back in safety from the enchanted forest. He had become separated from King Arthur, and was now quite alone among the trees of this strange place, but just in front of him he could still hear the baying and yelping of the 60 coal-black hounds. He rode on as fast as he could, and then something happened that would have amazed another knight, but did not surprise King Pellinore at all, because he had known such a thing to happen before. The baying of the hounds suddenly became muffled and strange, as if they had disappeared inside a cave. The king turned the corner, and there in front of him stood a great beast that was not like a lion, nor a bear, nor even a dragon, nor anything in the world except itself. It stood and glared at him, before turning around and lumbering away, crashing through the undergrowth, with as much noise as a hippopotamus would have made. And through the mouth of the beast there still came the muffled baying of the hounds. This strange monster had swallowed them all, but they seemed to still be hunting the fairy stag in the very middle of the beasts inside. King Pellinore gave a great shout, for he had been hunting this beast all his life, and knew that he would probably go on hunting it until he died, and never be able to kill it after all. But meanwhile he followed it hard, through bush and briar, often losing sight of it, but always hearing the strange muffled music of the fairy hounds. At last the beast disappeared altogether, and he saw a lady sitting by a fountain, who showed him the path that he must take through the enchanted forest, and told him that already the Black Knight and the pretty weeping maiden had gone that way. So then King Pellinore knew that in following the beast he had come in the right direction for the fulfillment of his vow. He heard the hounds still baying, but a long, long way off, as he hurried down the path shown him by the lady. In a very few minutes he reached a clearing in the wood, where two beautiful tents, one blue and one crimson, were set up opposite each other in the flickering lights and shadows of the trees. At the door of one of these tents stood the maiden he had come to save, and on the trodden grass in the middle of the clearing, the Black Knight, on the black horse, was doing battle with sword and shield against another knight who seemed almost as big and strong as his enemy. King Pellinore poised his spear in his raised hand, and galloping forward, drove his way between them. "How now?" he cried. "How is this? Who are you both that you fight in this way for the lady yonder, who belongs to neither of you, but came of her own will to ask the protection of King Arthur?" The Black Knight had pulled his great horse onto its haunches, but he shouted back at King Pellinore, whom he did not know as one of the knights of the Round Table. "The lady is mine!" cried the Black Knight, shaking his lance. "This foolish fellow here is trying to steal her from me, but she is mine. I fought King Arthur for her, and I conquered him." "That is not true!" shouted King Pellinore, and his voice in its anger rang all through the forest. "I was there, and I saw it. You carried the lady away before a single knight of the Round Table had time to spring to arms and do battle for her. But every man of King Arthur's court knows you have no right to her. I have followed the coal-black hounds, and the beast which swallowed the hounds, all the way through this enchanted forest, to take the lady back again. Come, meet me here in this open space of grass, and we will soon see which is the better man." Then the Black Knight rushed upon King Pellinore, and with their swords and shields and spears they fought until the forest rang with the noise. But the king was soon the conqueror. He killed the Black Knight's horse, and when he saw his enemy lying on the crushed turf, he also sprang to the ground, to finish the fight fairly on foot. And finish it he did, for he cut off the wicked Black Knight's head. Then the other knight, who had watched the battle from a little distance, came forward gladly, and told King Pellinore to take the lady back to Arthur's court. "I was but trying to save her from the Black Knight," he said. "I knew that he had no right to her." And he brought out a fresh, strong horse that had been tethered to a tree, and put King Pellinore's saddle and bridle upon it, and said that he would care for the tired hot horse, which had been in the battle. Then he went up to the door of the tent, and giving his hand to the lady, led her forward. The lady had stopped crying now, and had let down her long veil, and wound her hood about her head, so that King Pellinore could not see her face. He lifted her into the saddle before springing up in front of her, and as she lay for an instant in his powerful arms, there seemed to rise to his nostrils the perfume of wild roses and violets washed in dew. How lightly she seemed to sit behind him, too. His big horse took no count of her extra weight as it trotted off through the trees, where the night shadows were gathering and the stars already twinkling high up above the boughs. On and on rode King Pellinore and the lady until it was quite dark. Then he stopped his horse, and lifted her down, and guarded her while she slept under the trees. He was almost surprised to see in the morning that she was still there, because he guessed she was more than half a fairy, and unlike an ordinary mortal. When they rode on again, and passed out of the enchanted forest, he wondered if she would take wing, like a moth or a butterfly, and remain behind. But she did not, and when the sun was high in the sky, both king and lady rode safely into the courtyard of the castle at Camelot. Then King Arthur and Sir Gawain, who having soon lost the sound of the fairy hunt, had returned without encountering any adventures worth recording, and all the rest came out to meet them, and welcomed the lady right gladly, and gave praise and honour to King Pellinore. But the lady was still veiled, and at last King Arthur turned to her with courtesy. "You will find shelter and happiness forever at my court," said he. "The knights of the Round Table will be at your service always, ready to protect you, and never failing to honour you. But you came and went almost as swiftly, and with as much surprise to us as the fairy hunt itself, to which somehow I think you half belong. Will you then let us now see your face?" Then the lady threw back her veil and hood, and showed her pretty radiant face to the king and all his knights. The knights murmured in admiration, for she was very beautiful. But the king cried out with joy, for he knew her now, as he had not known her when the Black Knight carried her away. "You are sweet Nimue," he exclaimed. "You are she who showed me the barge in which I rode to take my sword Excalibur from the hand that held it above the water. You are one of those wonderful beings who love the world of knighthood, one of the ladies of the lake." Nimue smiled, and let her veil fall again before she answered. "Yes, I am Nimue, a lady of the lake," she said, "and you have fulfilled your promise to me, King Arthur. From today, I shall never be far away from you. With the other ladies, my fairy friends, I will come and go between the enchanted forest and the royal and knightly court of Camelot." This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to stories of King Arthur and his knights. If you enjoy this podcast, please send an email to kluker@marshallpl.org to tell me of your favorite stories. I'll talk to you again soon.